authorized to declare a recess of the committee at any time. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for an opening statement. So the view from the chair seat looks a little different today, and that's by design. Committee hearings should elicit thoughtful and productive discussion about the issues of the day, and yet most hearings are structured to do just the opposite. Members sit in rows, divided by party, with senior members literally sitting above their junior colleagues. We look at each other in profile, or even worse, we're staring at the back of each other's heads, which I have two concerns about. One, it's not the best way to have dialogue, and two, I'm thinning in the back, and I know you smell what I'm cooking. Witnesses who are there to share their expertise are often seated below us, or even though they know more than we do on many of these issues. And a lot of interesting exchanges get cut short because of the 5-minute rule, and there's no real flow to the discussion because members are running back and forth between multiple hearings, and they jump from one topic to another and then back again. So instead of generating interesting debate and good ideas, hearings too often promote political posturing and sound bites for social media. That's definitely not what the framers intended. Woodrow Wilson once famously noted that Congress in session is Congress on public exhibition, whilst Congress in its committee rooms is Congress at work. Unfortunately, this hasn't been the case for quite some time. So the Select Committee is trying something different today. Earlier this year, we adopted committee rules that give us the flexibility to experiment with how we structure our hearings. And our goal is to encourage thoughtful discussion and civil exchange of ideas and opinions. Committee members agreed that the ability to look right at each other when speaking and when listening matters. So does the ability to extend a meaningful exchange with a witness or a colleague. These two simple guideposts provided the framework for our hearing today. And given the topic of today's hearing, building a more civil and collaborative congressional culture, this approach makes good sense. So, in accordance with Clause 2J of House Rule 11, we will allow 1 hour of extended questioning per witness, and without objection, these 2 hours will not be strictly segregated between witnesses, which will allow up to 2 hours of back and forth exchanges between members and witnesses. Vice Chair Timmons and I will manage the time to ensure that every member has equal opportunity to participate. Any member who wishes to speak should signal their request to me or Vice Chair Timmons. You can just wave or gesture or bird noise. Additionally, members who wish to claim their individual 5 minutes to question each witness pursuant to Clause 2J2 of Rule 11 will be permitted to do so following the 2 hours of extended questioning. Okay. That's the formal stuff. This committee's mission is to make Congress work better for the American people, and one way we do that is to practice what we preach. It's one thing to call for a more civil and collaborative process, but it's another to actually do it. In trying out new approaches, this committee is modeling what's possible. We understand that what we're doing today may be difficult to pull off in some House committees, but subcommittees can provide a good venue for experimentation. Simple agreement between a chair and a ranking member can open the door to new approaches that inspire genuine participation in the legislative process. Modernization doesn't happen without experimentation. Institutions evolve through a process of trial and error, and if we don't try new things, we risk stagnation. We owe the American people a strong legislative branch that's capable of continuing upholding its Article I responsibilities. We also owe the American people a Congress that's capable of engaging in constructive conflict. The goal in airing conflict shouldn't be to simply highlight differences. The goal should be to establish clear positions, have meaningful discussions, test different compromises, and ultimately find a way forward. I'm consistently struck that Congress as an institution has some unique cultural challenges. It's the first organization in which I've worked where there's not a widely embraced mission or set of goals. Indeed, Congress often feels like 435 independent contractors, all loosely affiliated with one of 2 general contractors, that appear to be in a high-stakes competition for market share. The incentives, as one of our witnesses today points out in his book, which I read on my airplane flight, are often not to build or fix the institution, but rather to bash it. Much of what vexes the institution is not failures in rules and procedures, but the breakdown of norms, or for lack of a better phrase, corporate culture. And finally, there's a recognition that polarization in Congress is often reflective of disagreement we see in American society. So, today we are joined by 2 experts who are going to help us understand the various factors and trends over the past several decades that have contributed to the high levels of polarization we see in both society and Congress today. They'll also get us thinking about how members perceive their roles within Congress and strategies we might consider for normalizing civil and collaborative behavior. I'm looking forward to their testimony and conversation, and I'd like to now invite Vice Chair Timmons to share some opening remarks as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank both of our witnesses for taking the time to come today. We really do appreciate it, and we look forward to this conversation. I think that this is possibly the most important work this committee will do. We're doing a lot of important work, but making Congress more civil, more collaborative is probably what I believe to be the most important thing that we can do, because there's no collaboration, there's no civility. It's remarkable that this is where we are, but it is a symptom of where we are as a country, and we got to work on the country, but we really got to lead in Congress. So I spent a lot of time in the 116th Congress on the calendar and the schedule, because I think that spending more time together, I call it pinballing all over the Capitol complex, and building relationships is the beginning of the conversation, because we're not having policy-based discussions. We're using talking points. You never have to defend your ideas in front of your colleagues, and you're on Twitter spouting off mean things, and that gets clicks, and then you go on television and say even meaner things, and guess what? We're not going to fix immigration that way. We're not going to fix our debt. We're not going to fix healthcare. We have to have policy-based conversations from a place of mutual respect, and hear people's ideas and find common ground to move forward, and that's what we need. That's what the American people deserve. So I think that without fixing the process, giving people opportunities to get to know one another and spend time together, we're never going to be able to have these conversations. And so I just really appreciate y'all taking the time, and I'm looking forward to it. I do want to point out that this week is possibly the best example of what's wrong with this place. We had votes at 6:30 on Monday. We're leaving in 2 or 3 hours. Today's Thursday. So we didn't do anything on Monday or today, except for this hearing, which is wonderful. And we had 2 days of which, 3 members of this committee serve on 4 committees. And I don't know their committee schedule, but I promise you that they were double booked multiple times. We had floor votes yesterday for, oh my goodness, seven 20-minute
Thank you for the opportunity to testify today. It's an honor to be able to contribute something to the enormously important work that you're doing, and to think with you a little bit about how to improve the culture of the Congress. In my written remarks, I offer some reflections on the sources of today's cultural distempers and on how what's happening in this institution is related to some broader trends in our society. I'm happy to discuss that, of course, in our conversation. In these brief opening remarks, I thought that I would draw out just one part of that testimony, which focuses on a few key principles for reform, some crucial points to remember, maybe pitfalls to avoid, as you consider ways of improving the culture of the institution. I would start by saying that it's important to remember that prescription is not diagnosis in reverse when we think about how to fix institutions. There are reasons why Congress is the way it is, good and bad, but those reasons don't offer us a map for improving things. You can't go backwards and try to play that movie in reverse and think you'll solve problems. So that understanding how we got here can help us to understand some of the constraints that reformers face in trying to fix things, but doesn't offer us a map of where to go next. Secondly, I would really urge you to avoid the lure of selective nostalgia when thinking about Congress. The problems with the contemporary Congress is not that it isn't like it used to be. It's that in some ways it isn't what it needs to be today. And it's important to think about the difference between those. It's easy to approach the kind of work that you're doing in this committee by trying to think back to some golden age when Congress supposedly worked and everybody supposedly got along. I would just say it's very unlikely that whatever golden age you have in mind was actually as golden as you might remember or as people might say. And it's important to see that change has to happen going forward and not going backward. Your committee very wisely describes itself as devoted to modernization of Congress. Modernization involves adapting to changing circumstances, and that's the right attitude to maintain, even if there are lessons we can learn from the past. Third, I would really urge you to focus on incentives when thinking about the culture. Members of this institution behave the way you do for reasons, for serious reasons. You are all intelligent men and women, ambitious men and women, and you're trying to succeed and to achieve something for your constituents and for your country. And so when culture breaks down, there are reasons that have to do with incentives, with the kinds of pressures you face. And if we want to think about how to change the culture, it's important to think about how to change incentives. Some of the strongest incentives that members face are obviously electoral incentives, which aren't so easy for Congress itself to change. But there are also incentives created by the nature of legislative work itself, by the nature of the schedule, the nature of the structure of the institution, which can be very powerful, which shape behavior as much as they shape work. And it's important to think about change in terms of altering incentives. Fourth, and related to that, I would say that reforming the culture of Congress requires reforming the work of Congress. It is worth thinking about things like how to encourage members to spend more time together, how to encourage members to take retreats together or have dinner together. That matters. But I would say that ultimately what matters more is the work of the institution. The culture will change if the work encourages a different kind of culture. And just spending time together is not really a way to get at the core of the culture of the institution. You have to think about how Congress works and therefore how its members work. And fifth and finally, I would urge you to think explicitly about how you understand the purpose of the Congress. Reforms of the institution, including reforms focused on improving its culture, have to take for granted some idea of the purpose of Congress's work. But there is a rather deep disagreement about that purpose that I think is implicit now in a lot of the thinking that surrounds congressional reform, and that sometimes leaves some of that work incoherent. Simply put, I would say reformers have to ask yourselves whether the purpose of the Congress is maybe like the purpose of a European Parliament, to enable the majority party to achieve its objectives while it's in office until the public throws it out, or whether the purpose of the Congress is to enable or even compel accommodation across lines of difference in American society, to bring people together across difference. Those goals are not mutually exclusive, obviously, but particularly in an era of closely divided parties, they can really point in different directions. That latter purpose, enabling accommodation, bargaining, compromise, deal-making, is plainly, I think, implicit in the constitutional design of the legislative branch. The U.S. Congress really isn't like a European Parliament. It is intended to work across lines of difference. And I think the distinction between the two is especially important when thinking about the culture of the institution. A culture of implacable partisan polarization is not necessarily an obstacle to the functioning of a purely majoritarian legislature like a European Parliament. But it is absolutely an obstacle to the cause of a more accommodationist, compromise-driven model of legislative work. In essence, I think reformers need to decide if the goal of reform is to make cross-partisan engagement less necessary or more likely. That you're concerned about that kind of question and that you're concerned about the culture of the institution suggests to me that you take that kind of cross-partisan engagement to be an essential goal of congressional reform. And that's certainly my own view, too. I think we have to wrestle with that question of what ultimately is the purpose of the institution. How do we expect it to solve problems before we can get to particular reforms? My written testimony does suggest a few categories of particular reforms that could be especially useful, I think, in moving the culture of Congress in a particular direction, and I'm happy to get into those. But I thought that starting with these general principles might be a way into a broader conversation. And in any case, I now stand in your way of hearing from Molly Reynolds, who's truly one of the great Congress experts and knowledgeable in a way that I couldn't hope to be. So I'm going to get out of her way and let her inform you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Levin. Our second witness is Molly Reynolds. Dr. Reynolds is a senior fellow in governance studies at the Brookings Institution. She studies Congress with an emphasis on how congressional rules and procedures affect domestic policy outcomes. Dr. Reynolds is the author of Exceptions to the Rule, The Politics of Filibuster Limitations in the U.S. Senate, which explores the creation, use, and consequences of the budget reconciliation process and other procedures that prevent filibusters in the U.S. Senate. Her current research projects include work on oversight in the House of Representatives, congressional reform, and the congressional budget process. She also supervises the maintenance of vital statistics on Congress, Brookings' long-running resource on the first branch of government. Dr. Reynolds, welcome back to our committee. You are now recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Kilmer, Vice Chair Timmons, members of the committee, and staff. Again, my name is Molly Reynolds. I'm a senior fellow in the Governance Studies program at the Brookings Institution, and I'm so appreciative of the opportunity to be back to today testify on how Congress might improve its culture. With my time this morning, I want to... Is that better?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay. With my time this morning, I want to build on two of the principles that you've all laid out in his testimony, that prescription is not diagnosis in reverse, and the necessity of avoiding the lure of selective nostalgia. I will draw today on my own research and that of other political scientists, and I want to offer some observations on why these principles are so important. To begin, a review of a few familiar but useful trends in American politics may be helpful. Voters today are better sorted into the two parties along both ideological lines and social identities. Research also suggests this increasing homogeneity has led voters to see partisanship as a stronger component of their social identity, which in turn leads them to see themselves as more different from and to dislike members of the other party. Second, on the issue of polarization in Congress. While any single approach will have drawbacks, the measure most often used by political scientists indicates that polarization in Congress was relatively low between the 1930s and the 1970s, but grew to record levels by the 2000s. The period of increasing polarization since the 1970s has been asymmetric to the extent that it has been more associated with the movement of Republican legislators to the right than with Democratic members to the left. To the extent that Democrats have moved in a more liberal direction, it has been driven by demographic change in the caucus, as additional female representatives and representatives of color have been elected as Democrats. Indeed, the House has 9 times as many women, 4.5 times as many African Americans, 9 times as many Latinos and Latinas, and 7.5 times as many Asian Americans today as it did in 1971. To be clear, a more diverse House of Representatives, which better reflects the diversity of the country, is a good thing for our democracy. But a more diverse chamber cannot and should not operate under the same institutional culture that its less diverse predecessors did. The changing demographics are not the only reason why we cannot divorce a conversation about the changing culture of Congress from one about racial politics in the United States. We must also consider the consequences of the realignment of Southern white voters from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. As political scientist Francis Lee, who this panel heard from in the 116th Congress, has argued, one consequence of the long post-war dominance of the Democratic Party in Congress is that it shaped members' expectations about the outcome of the next election. Members of both parties believed that Democrats would hold the majority during this period. Beginning in 1980, both parties began to see the majority as winnable, and members' behavior changed accordingly. When party control is seen to hang in the balance, members see more value in a style of partisanship that disincentivizes cooperation. Charting a course for change also requires being honest about elements of previous Congresses that may have encouraged a collaborative culture, but to which we cannot return for other good reasons. Here, I would point to the example of calls for members to move their families to Washington. The notion that the culture of Congress has changed for the worse because members and their families do not socialize with each other is widely held. The shift away from relocating one's family is often attributed to changing expectations in the 1980s and 1990s, whereby members should avoid being seen to have gone Washington. Viewing time spent in Washington as something to be avoided is detrimental to the health of the institution, and we should work to change the understanding of it. But even if this framing is harmful, that does not mean that the push to roll back one of its consequences and calling for more members to relocate to Washington is automatically the right thing to do. We lack comprehensive data on the occupations of congressional spouses, either historically or today, but it's fair to suspect that many more members today come from dual career families. And if we care about continuing to diversify the range of perspectives which lawmakers bring to Washington, we do not want to create systematic barriers to individuals with caregiving responsibilities from serving in Congress. Finally, I will urge you, especially as you think about improving the norms of interpersonal behavior that facilitate but are distinct from legislative behavior, to consider what a culture of civility is in service of. Civility and good interpersonal behavior more generally can encourage collaboration and other productive methods of doing legislative work. But calls for civility also have a long history of serving as a means of attempting to suppress marginalized groups. The norms that persist are the ones that members believe will serve them well. That can also mean they help preserve the existing status quo. Building new norms requires convincing members inclusively that they will help them accomplish their goals. With that, I might yield back to Yuval to begin a conversation about proposed reforms that might advance the goal of a more civil and collaborative culture.
I'd like to ask both witnesses whether they have any additional points or comments that they want to make, having heard one another speak before we move on to member dialogue and questions.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that, and I appreciate the opportunity to respond to Molly's very thoughtful remarks. I think, as she suggested at the end, that it might be worth our spending this brief period thinking about specific ideas for change that might build out from some of the points we've made and some of the points we each make in our testimony. And I would do that by stressing the point I suggested, which is that changing culture means changing work, especially. And it's important to think not only in terms of how we can get members to cooperate more, to get to know each other more, all of which matters. It's important that we think in terms of categories like budget reform. The budget has always been at the core of the culture of this institution from the very beginning. It's at the essence of what Congress does. The power of the purse shapes the ambition that members come here with and the nature of the work they do. And Congress has moved to change the nature of the budget process very often in response to what are, in effect, challenges to its culture, or rather to its ability to work effectively. The budget process that you work with today, which comes from the middle of the 1970s, is not well suited to the needs that Congress has now. I think that's true both in terms of needs that involve spending federal money, but as well as the need to work together across party lines in an institution that is divided and that has been closely divided now for a generation. This budget process comes from a time when one party had held control for 20 years and expected to hold control forever, and did for another 20 years after that. But that's not been the case now for quite a while. And a budget process that's suited to a Congress where each party thinks it might gain control next time, I think would look rather different than the kind of consolidated process you have now, which, if you think about it, assumes an enormous amount of coordination capacity, which now is very difficult in Congress. I think it is very important to think in terms of budget reform if you want to change the culture, the nature of the institution. Secondly, I would urge you to think, as this committee has in very constructive ways, about ways of re-empowering the committees of the House, the committees of the Congress. That's important both for advancing the work of the institution, but also for allowing members to see how they can matter, even if they don't happen to be the speaker or the majority leader or even a committee chair, and allowing members to see how their time is spent in ways that translate into meaningful work they can show their constituents and they can point to in explaining how they're improving the country. Committees are enormously important in that way, and I would distinguish strengthening the committees from strengthening individual members. That is, it's not just about decentralization. It's about that middle level where members work together and engage with each other over concrete substantive policy issues. I think that's enormously important if we want to think about changing the culture. And finally, I would just point to one idea that's in my testimony, which I think it can be a sensitive issue in Congress, but has to do with the question of transparency. There are a lot of ways in which the increased transparency in this institution has done an enormous amount of good. A public institution needs to be transparent, but there also need to be forums in which members can work together in private. A lot of the work of Congress is bargaining and negotiation. Bargaining and negotiation are not well served by absolute transparency. So that while it's very important that members be answerable for the decisions they make, that they are ultimately responsible for their votes and for proposals and ideas, there has to be some room for negotiation. That fact is now dealt with by members working with each other outside the structure of the Congress, creating little groups where they meet and talk about what a bill could include. Well, that's what a committee is supposed to be. And the reason that that doesn't happen in the committees is, frankly, that it's very hard to do that on television or live streamed to your most engaged constituents. There has to be some room for some engagement with one another before members step out in front of cameras and do the part of their work that's ultimately public. I know that's easier for me to say than it is for you to say, but I think it's very important to think about as you ask yourselves how to improve the culture of the institution.
Thank you. So to start, I will sort of endorse many of the ideas that Yuval offered in his remarks there. And then I will say that generally, I think what's important for improving legislative behavior is creating more opportunities for members to have efficacy in the legislative process. I would encourage you to think about more ways to provide members opportunities to claim credit for legislative wins, even when those wins don't involve the passage of a bill on which you were the lead sponsor. So this would include things like formatting committee reports in such a way that make clear which provisions were added as the result of member requests at the drafting stage or as the result of specific member amendments. Providing a clearer accounting of which standalone bills are incorporated into large omnibus packages that would help acknowledge the hard work of the members in the committees that went into those individual components. Another approach would be to involve sort of formally designating what you might think of as a lead bill co-author, so a kind of additional category between sort of the formal sponsor of a bill and the co-sponsors to signal in some formal way that someone else had made major contributions to the origins of a bill. The last thing I'll say is that while I think these reforms and the kinds that you've all mentioned are important, there are limits to what you can change by changing your rules and procedure about the culture of the institution. I say that not to discourage you from doing this hard work because it's incredibly important, but just to acknowledge, if anything, to make it more important that you do the best work that you can, but to acknowledge that there are lots of things outside these four walls that shape your culture as well. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate both of your. Sorry.
Yeah, but now.
Thank you. Appreciate both of your testimony. Until the end of the hearing, this will be the last formal thing I say. I now recognize myself and Vice Chair Timmons to begin 2 hours of extended questioning of both witnesses. Any member who wishes to speak should single out their request to me or to Vice Chair Timmons. So prior to the hearing, Vice Chair Timmons and I had a little bit of a discussion around just some of the things that got teed up in the testimony. Both in your written testimony mentioned committee empowerment, member empowerment. There was a discussion of budget and appropriations reform. I know Vice Chair Timmons wants to hit on the issue of time and schedule and how that impacts things. So we have a few threads to pull, and as we mentioned at the start of this hearing, our intent is to have this be a little bit more free-flowing so that rather than being a regimented 5 minutes per person, that if we're hitting on a topic that you want to ask a question about, let us know, and you can ask a question. That's part of the idea here. So maybe just to kick us off, I want to get a better sense from you of what committee empowerment looks like, and that, you know, if I airdropped you onto this committee, other than running, screaming for the door, what would you do? What would you recommend to better empower committees? I know Yeah, and Dr. Levin, in your book, you actually referenced the fact that, some of what we see now in terms of centralization of power was due to reforms in prior generations. So what do we unwind? What do we change? What does committee empowerment look like?
Well, thank you very much, Chair Kilmer, for the question. I would start by stressing that point, which is that a lot of the problems we face now were solutions to problems that members faced in a prior generation. And that's just natural. That's how institutions evolve. It doesn't even mean they were wrong to do what they did. A lot of the centralization of power that happened in Congress began in the 1970s in response to excessively powerful committee chairs. And a sense among younger members that some committee chairs, especially Southern Democrats, were standing in the way of important reforms that a lot of members felt that they had been elected to advance. And they worked to take away some of the power of those committee chairs. And the way they could do that as young members was to move that power to leadership and to empower their party leaders to take away some of the authority that committee chairs had. And that began a process of centralization. I think there's another wave of that came in the 1990s when Republicans took control of Congress for the first time in decades. And frankly, they didn't have much experience of running the institution through the committee system. They had been elected thanks to the work of a speaker and majority leader, and they gave that speaker and majority leader a lot of power, which ended up centralizing power away from the committees in ways that did advance some important agenda items, but that have left us in a situation now where I think a lot of members feel like their time on just a normal week in Congress is not devoted to enough work that's really going to ultimately matter and result in legislation, result in something they can show their constituents. To me, it's very important to think about the answer to that in terms of committee empowerment more than individual member empowerment. Congress is plural. It is not an institution where a single member can really drive the agenda. And empowering individual members, I think, very often just results in grandstanding, because that's what members can do. They can find a camera and make their name that way. The committees have a very distinct and unusual role in the institution because they allow power to flow in ways that enable groups of members to work together and represent some of the diversity of the larger institution that can then result in legislation that might have a chance of moving. So to me, empowering committees really means allowing the everyday work that members do in committee to result in legislation. And it is not nearly enough the case now that work has any chance of really resulting in legislation. One practical idea I'd point to is something that a lot of state legislatures do now. More than 20 state legislatures allow committees to control some floor time so that there's once a month in most cases a certain amount of time that belongs to the committee, to the chair and the ranking member, or different legislatures do this differently, where generally speaking, what happens in that time is that legislative proposals that have passed the committee, so have some support that reflects some of the breadth of the larger legislature, can move to the floor regardless of whether the party leaders want that or not. That time belongs to the chair or to the committee. And that means that the work of the committee, especially when that work is somewhat consensus-driven, has the support of a large number, and some state legislatures require that there be a supermajority on the committee for a bill to meet the requirement of that time, can actually get to the floor. And that means that members don't have to think about whether what they're doing will satisfy their party leader. They can look at the people around them, around the committee room, and see that this work can get somewhere, that if we work together and get to a place where enough of us agree, then the larger legislature can look at it. That's one idea. There are many others. But I think the point of that is to enable the work that's done in committee to matter. I would describe the problem right now as a sense that work really doesn't matter enough, and that what you can do in committee is, badger somebody in such a way that might get you on your favorite cable news channel that night, rather than thinking about producing legislation that might actually get somewhere.
I will just start where you've all ended, which is to say that I completely agree with this notion that one of the challenges with committees right now is that there is often no reason to believe that the hard work done in committee will result in legislation that actually comes to the floor and has a chance of becoming law. And you've all suggested one way to address that is by giving committees protected floor time. Sort of related proposal would be to guarantee each committee sort of some number of bills that they get to bring to the floor each session. So I think there are a number of different ways you could approach that, but fundamentally, I think that that is the central challenge here. The other thing I would say, going back to some of the history where you've all started, is that when we talk about empowering committees, we need to be careful to specify what we mean by that, and that what I think we want is committees where individual members feel like that is the place where they can have a say in the legislative process. And one of the sort of part of how we ended up where we are today is reforms that disempowered committee chairs because they had sort of developed little fiefdoms around the institution where even we would have said in the middle of the 20th century that committees were quite powerful, but that they were not powerful in a way that meant that individual members felt like that was the avenue through which they could have input into the legislative process. And so as we think about empowering committees, I think we want to be clear that we want them to be places where real legislative work is done by all of the participants and not just, say, the leaders of each individual committee.
I know Vice Chair Timmons wants to hit on this, and I think Mr. Phillips also wanted to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually going to step back a little bit and try to frame this. I'm seeing three kind of areas of focus. Time is one, and we've talked about the calendar. In 2019, we traveled for 70 days, and we were here for 65 full days. That's crazy. We made a recommendation last Congress about 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off. We can talk more about that, but it's not just being here more, it's our time here and how we're efficient with the floor schedule and how we're efficient to not be in multiple places at once with committees and subcommittees. So we're working in that area, and I'm sure we're going to talk more about that. So if the first is time, the second is relationship building opportunities, and we've talked about a number of different ways that we can do that, and we're going to go deeper in that category. And then the third, and I definitely agree, one of the most important, I refer to it as restructuring incentives. And you've got budget reform, and that's huge. We haven't passed a budget in decades. I mean, it's just crazy. And I like the idea of restructuring committees and empowering members, and we've been talking about that. And another thing would be maybe expedited hearings for. We have the discharge petition, which is useless. I mean, it's just a messaging device. And then, maybe creating a lower threshold for a discharge petition, but making it equal Rs and Ds. So ADRs and ADDs, and you get a hearing, or maybe within the committee, you get, 50% or 40% of the actual committee, but it has to be equal Rs and Ds. You'll get you expedite a hearing, or you can force a hearing, or just anything that we can do to create an incentive for bipartisanship, because I think that's huge. So can y'all speak really quick? Do you agree that those are the three categories that we should be focused on: time, relationship building opportunities, and then restructuring incentives? Is that fair, or is there another area that you think would be important to add to our top three?
Well, thank you. I do agree that those are three important categories. I think I would place the third of those first.
Sure.
And that it's particularly important to think about the nature and work of the institution. I'd also say one other thing. The way you put things, and the way that I would often put things too, which says it's crazy we haven't passed a budget in 30 years, or it's really now 7 years, I guess, since there was really an organized budget process. Maybe it's not that crazy. Maybe the question is, if this is how Congress works now, what should the rules be to enable that to be a way to pass legislation? If we're not going to push our way through the 74 budget process, what are we doing? And what would it look like for a Congress that wants to do that, to establish its rules in a way that enable that to lead to constructive legislation? I think it's worth your while as members to think about, how are we working? If what it takes to pass a bill on infrastructure is to put aside the committee system and get members together in a private room to talk about infrastructure, well, maybe that's what the committee system should be. If we can't seem to get a budget passed in the way that the budget process requires, but there are other ways that we do spending bills, well, let's think about what the budget process would look like if it actually enabled members to do what the evidence suggests they want to do. This is your institution. You can change the rules. The Constitution creates very, very broad frameworks for what your work has to involve and lets you set the rules within that to a very great degree. None of these rules is sacred. None of these things has to be this way. And if you ask yourself, you know, on that flight where you spend most of your time, you ask yourself, why am I spending so much of my time here? The answer to that can just be, well, maybe I just shouldn't. And there are ways to change this. I would think the same way about the budget process, about the committee system. You really can change the way this works. I think that's the premise of this committee. It's a premise that a lot of members need to internalize. And really, before attacking Congress for failing to do something, think about how to change Congress so that it could succeed in doing what you think you were elected to do.
I know Mr. Phillips wants to get in on this.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to continue on the theme of incentives to which you both refer. The incentives here are perverse, I think it's fair to say. And I'd like to go further upstream. We all know that members who come from very safe districts not only are not rewarded for working together, they're punished. They're labeled as traitors by their base, whether it's a deep blue district or a deep red district. So my question for each of you is, are there some changes to our electoral system that might reward candidates on both sides of the aisle who would come here with the ethos of working together? Is ranked choice voting or independent redistricting commissions or changes to our primary system? Any thoughts on how to create a reward system before people come here to incentivize collaboration?
So reforms to the electoral process are certainly beyond my expertise, but I would say that it is important to think about the sort of biggest incentive structure possible when you are asking yourselves kind of, why do the incentives that you face shape your behavior in the ways that you do? So the question is absolutely the right one. I can't speculate. I don't know if you all would like to on sort of exactly which reforms to the electoral system might change your incentives and thus your behavior in specific ways. But I do think it's the right question to ask.
Mr. Levin?
Well, I would only say that I think it's important to experiment with changes on that front because that is the most powerful incentive that a lot of members face. And I say experiment because it's easy to get things wrong in unexpected ways. I think the incentives that members confront now have to do a lot of the time with a set of election reforms that were advanced in the 1970s that created the primary system we know now that were intended to solve real problems and that it ended up creating, I think in some ways, bigger problems. That was not the intention of their designers. They were not meant to make our system more partisan, but they absolutely have made our system more partisan. So I do believe that there's great value in experimenting, particularly with ranked choice voting for the House. But I think it's enormously important that that be experimentation. And the reason I think it's valuable is because this institution is meant to be representative of the breadth of our society. And that means it has to represent more finely some of the distinctions and differences that exist. I would put this way. I think one of the strange things about the contemporary Congress is that there aren't a lot of intra-party factions. Polarization, on the one hand, means the parties get more and more different from each other. It also means the parties get more and more similar internally. And there are fewer internal differences among Republicans and Democrats that might allow for some room for some Republicans to work with some Democrats. The electoral system can help to change that. And there is some experimentation happening in Alaska next year, and it's being considered in a variety of places, as you know. I think that's very constructive, and that it's important when we face an element of our system that we think is failing us, that we ask ourselves, how can we change it? And that we try to do that and see what happens. And so I'm encouraged by those experiments, but we shouldn't assume we know how they'll go, because these kinds of things have a way of surprising us.
Agreed. Thank you.
I think Mr. Perlmutter wants to get on this.
Yeah, I want to respond to Dean, and I'll just use Colorado as an example. We went to allow all unaffiliated voters to vote in the primary. And they get a Democratic ballot, they get a Republican ballot, they can choose one ballot and move forward. And I was opposed to it. I said, no, you got to be a member of the party. You know, you're working hard. So we did this 2 years ago. And as an example, John Hickenlooper, a former governor, sort of a moderate centrist kind of guy, deal maker, was running against Andrew Romanoff, our speaker, who's a darling of the left. And based on what we saw from sort of party kinds of things, Andrew was going to clean his clock. And John ended up clobbering him because the unaffiliated voters in this instance, and moderate Democrats, just said, you know, no, this is our guy. And so that did moderate kind of the extremes in that instance. And I was opposed to us going to this thing, and I was wrong, you know.
And I think we've got a couple more questions around incentives before we shift gears. I have one on incentives, and then I know Vice Chair Timmons does too. So one example of where the incentives have broken down is on the floor. You know, I came out of a state legislature where every bill was taken up under an open rule. And in 8 years in the Washington State Legislature, I can count maybe 5 or 6 times where people used that to make political hay. But by and large, the incentive was, or at least the norm was, don't be a jerk. In part because you don't know when you're going to be in the minority and you don't want people to be a jerk to you. And yet, we see a lot of the activity in our nation's capital, certainly much more focused on making political statements than on trying to make law. So how would we change the incentives on that? How, you know, I think this gets into this issue of member empowerment too. People want to have a sense of efficacy, but it's this tricky dynamic. I shared with Dr. Reynolds, you know, when I was 10 years old, my parents gave me the opportunity to have free reign over the pantry and to use the stove, and I quickly gained like 70 pounds, right? It was very empowering, but I abused it, right? And, you know, and then I lost the keys to the pantry, right? So, which is why we have closed rules now. It's, you know, we've taken away the keys to the pantry. So what do we do?
So I will say that I think one of the biggest challenges here is convincing members that any opening up of the amendment process would be a durable, persistent change. And that one of the things that we have seen when both parties in both chambers have made steps down the road to a more open amendment process is that happens the first time members are confronted with the open pantry, to use your metaphor, Mr. Kilmer. They sort of go all in, and then the only response to kind of manage that chaos is to tamp down on the process in some way, and then say, "Look, we gave you a chance, and you all failed us." And so I think this isn't a sort of concrete proposal, except to say that they're getting from sort of A to Z on a more open floor process would be messy, and there would have to be just some willingness to kind of push through that sort of interregnum, that middle period before there was a new kind of equilibrium of more open debate.
I very much agree with that. I would add only that I think it also requires members to have a tolerance for the unpredictable. You know, we complain about centralization of power, and members certainly complain about it. But part of the reason it happens is the party leaders protect members from votes they don't want to take, and from votes they don't want to answer for at election time. And obviously, open rules can be used by one party to force members of the other party to take exactly those kind of votes. I think part of what it would take to think in terms of empowering members is building up a greater tolerance for expressing views on questions that are put on the table by the other party, where you may not want to tell your voters that that's your view on this question, but you don't really get to just not express an opinion when you run for Congress. So there are other things you could do in life, but you know, if you chose this one, you have to be willing to vote on hard questions. And I think that it's a mistake to think that the rules are all closed because the leaders want all the power. Part of the reason is members don't want to be exposed. And in calling for more open rules, which I think would be very helpful in a lot of ways, there has to be some openness to the chaos that results. I mean, that chaos is a process of negotiation and bargaining. Sometimes it's just politics too. And you know, I think members have to kind of know what they're in for and what they're asking for. and as Molly says, not be shocked the first time that this is abused and say, well, we got to go back to what we were doing before so we don't face this threat.
And if I could just add one thing, the one sort of perverse part of this is that one of the consequences of having more restrictive rules and fewer amendment votes is that then there are fewer votes overall. And so the ones that you do take get more attention than they would if you were voting on lots and lots of things. And so, yes, you are forced to take one vote over here that you didn't necessarily want to have to take, go on the record on something. But in a world where that's part of a much bigger set of votes, a much richer voting record, the consequences of any one vote may not be as high as they are in this more restrictive environment.
Yeah, Vice Chair Timmons.
Sure. Before I get to my question, I'm going to start with addressing this issue. I was in the state Senate for 2 years before I came to Congress, and every time we were in session, there were 46 of us. We sat in the room, and anybody could stand up and ask anything, propose an amendment, and we only had 2 instances in the entire 2 years where someone abused that process. And I think part of it is because when you take the well and you say something ridiculous, or you propose an idea that's ridiculous, you see the faces of your colleagues. And you see, one, you've intentionally done this to make half of them mad, and the other half, your party, is looking at you like, you're really doing this? Like, this is not appropriate. And so I think in large part, we're going to have to do some self-policing. And, if we do go down this more open route, the fringe are always going to try to take advantage of it. And it's going to be hard to police the other side, but we got to police our own side. We got to keep people moving in the right direction, because creating problems is not going to solve these huge challenges facing this country. So to my question, all these changes that we're discussing involve decentralization of power. Whether it's not being here, when you hear your pinballing around, that centralizes power to leadership. When the committee structure currently centralizes power to leadership. The incentives currently end up with 4 people making all the decisions in Congress, and you get a bill that's 5,000 pages long, and 6 hours later you're expected to vote on it. So all of these changes do decentralize power. So my question is this, and I'm going to give you my thoughts on it, and then I want yours. The fact that this committee exists indicates a willingness for change. The fact that we have been extended 1 year and then now a full Congress indicates a willingness to consider changes. The dysfunction is so severe that even leadership, I believe, is open to making some legitimate structural changes. Could you talk a little bit about your thoughts on the challenges with decentralization of power in regards to leadership?
Sure. So I would begin actually with a point related to something that you've all said in response to the last question, which is that one of the reasons that power is centralized in the way that it is because it is challenging in some situations, for individual committees to come to agreement on what a proposal should look like. And when an individual committee cannot do it, it gets sort of run up to the leadership. And that there are situations in which leaders are the ones who have sort of the power to say, this is what the deal is going to be. I'm not saying that's true in all of the cases, but I think these are all sort of pieces of the same puzzle. So in order for some power to flow away from the leadership, you need kind of somewhere else for it to go. And you need, I think we would both say, one place for it to go would be to committees. And there you need committees to have the tools and resources they need to be able to do the work and feel like if they do the hard work of getting to a proposal on which they agree, that proposal is actually going to go somewhere. And so I think as is the case with many things in Congress, I think sometimes we blame the centralization of power in the hands of party leaders for more of Congress's pathologies than it is necessarily the sort of chief cause of. And in some cases, it is the response to other challenges that Congress faces. It is what how Congress has evolved to deal with other challenges.
I very much agree with that, and I think it's important to see it. I mean, I would say the centralization that happened in the late 1990s. I was a staffer in the 90s on the Budget Committee, and then I worked for Speaker Gingrich in his final 2 years. And I would say that a lot of that centralization happened because Republicans had gotten elected on a very ambitious agenda of institutional reform, and none of the committees knew how to do that. They came in realizing they'd promised to do things that they just weren't equipped to do. And so they felt like the only way to do this is to put all the power in the Speaker's office and let this move. I think that over time created a culture in the House that left members without much experience of a more decentralized House, and so without a sense that they could really do it. So that while it's easy to complain when it feels like you have no power, it isn't, I think, simply obvious what a decentralized House would look like as a matter of moving a legislative agenda now. One other point I'd make is that there's also there's a way in which decentralization should be attractive to leaders now. Obviously, nobody wants to give up power, but the power that's now centralized in the leaders, in both party leaders in both houses, is excessive in their own view. I mean, we had a strange situation in 2 Congresses ago now, where the Speaker resigned, retired, whatever you want to say, and everybody looked around and said, "Who wants to be Speaker?" And nobody wanted to. And someone literally got forced to be Speaker, more or less. I think the reason for that is that the job has become very, very challenging as a matter of managing a coalition that looks to you to keep it from becoming unruly. I think it's just an unreasonable expectation to have of the Speaker, that speakers know that, and that there is some appeal to allowing more of the work of the institution to happen through the committees, where the Speaker can say, this is working its way through the House. Speakers say that now, but it isn't really true. And I think in some ways their quality of life would also be improved by it being more true. The argument for decentralization needs to look like that as made to them, because they've got to be persuaded that it makes sense for them to give up some power, which is never obvious or easy.
I would also say that it just is from purely a legislative throughput standpoint, the less power is in the hands of party leaders, the more work can be done. If right now, often the sort of MO is you have to get the leaders to sign off on the agreement, and so it's just a matter of workflow. There's only so much that can go through 4 people. And so as you kind of think about decentralizing, devolving some of that power, it also just opens up the possibility to do more work when there isn't the one potential bottleneck in the process.
I want to call on Mr. Joyce, but can I quickly ask, your recommendation about giving the committees floor time, isn't that in the rules now, like Calendar Wednesday? Or, I mean, isn't that basically in the rules and we waive them?
There are probably ways you could use the existing rules to try and do that. I think the bigger challenge is just convincing committees that they will actually get the opportunity to do that. And there are other ways. I don't want the time is one piece of it. I think thinking about it in kind of units of legislative proposals might be another one. The idea that each committee gets the ability to bring a package of some size to the floor, and that's protected is another way, I think, to approach that.
Okay, Mr. Joyce.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. In my limited time here, I've been here since 13, and I've certainly seen the ideas flow from Speaker's office leadership to the floor, and then we stuck voting on them. And then you have people who make a habit out of going out and saying, nobody could have read this bill. Now, being on appropriations, Derek, we work on these bills for long periods of time. Unfortunately, we know them things that are in your omnibus and things like that. Would it make more sense, and I wasn't here for the ACA, but certainly for the AHCA, to have, like that, a healthcare month? So all the committees of jurisdiction would have those hearings. That's all that would be taking place in the institution. and having, believe it or not, learned witnesses come in and talk about, like in Cleveland area, we had two fine institutions, Cleveland Clinic and UH. When you talk to the people there, they have great ideas on how to bring the cost of healthcare down. But having experts from throughout the country, because obviously the city of Cleveland is going to be different than some urban area or rural area, but have those people come in and testify, whether it's E&C, whether it's Ways and Means, and that's all the news media would have to focus on for that month would be the issue. So the American people, I believe they're bright enough to, when presented with, here's the problems, here are the costs, these are the potential resolutions, reach out to your congressman or reach out to your senators and let them know where you stand, that we'd have input throughout instead of having people running in against the institution and against the bill to the detriment of the American people. Does that sound like something that would work?
Well, I think that's certainly one way to think about how to focus the attention of members on their substantive work rather than on participating in the larger kind of theater of culture war politics, which is what you do when you don't have other ways of using your time constructively, frankly. It doesn't seem like the rest of what's available to you would be of any purpose, and so at least this is something voters do care about. I think one thing I'd say about that, there is value in the committees of the Congress, and Molly just got to this too, working in parallel on different issues. Congress can work on a lot of different things at the same time when it isn't the case that one person has to approve everything that gets done. And so there is a kind of advantage to parallel processing where different committees can focus on different areas at different times. And members don't have to think that their job is to focus the attention of the public on this issue in an intense way right now so that we can get something done, but rather see their everyday work as working on a variety of important public policy issues that move on the schedule that the system allows for. But I agree with you that members have to take account of the reality we're living in. And that reality means that there are times when significant legislation can only really move when there's public pressure within that theater of our politics. And there have to be ways of using the committee system and not just the platforms that are available to leaders to make that kind of change happen. So you have to be creative about how to do it.
I'll just add one note on this, on Yuval's point about parallel processing, which is that is part of the reason Congress has committees in the first place. So if we look at the history of the development of the committee system over time, the reason Congress created committees to handle specific jurisdictions of work was so that it could process more and more complicated issues in parallel at the same time, rather than having the whole Congress have to sort of take up and do the work on every issue, and to create kind of durable groups of members who could specialize in particular areas. So I think in that sense, allowing for that kind of parallel processing goes back to the very origins of why we have committees.
But healthcare is 1/6 of our economy. It's something that needs to be dealt with.
Absolutely.
Infrastructure, ever since I've been here, nothing has more bipartisan support and less get done than infrastructure. And here we are talking about it yet again. And one 17-hour markup in a committee does not make a bill. I mean, it takes more to figure out what the needs are for our country because they're different in all 50 of the states. I'm trying to think of a way that people have input and work through these things and work together in concert versus us against them.
I know we've been talking about member empowerment, and I know that Ms. Van Dyne wants to ask about freshman empowerment too, and new member, how new members are onboarded. So go ahead.
Thank you. Well, look, I sit in a seat where all of you have been as a freshman. We have that in common. My freshman orientation might have been a lot different than all of yours. Coming in during COVID and having everything separated, wearing masks, not really getting to know other members, new members. I'm interested in finding out a couple of things, many things, but two questions. From your perspective, freshman orientation was very different this time, and it seemed like we were very separated. Republicans, Democrats, the reason for that was we didn't have enough room, right, to have everybody together. Events that we would normally have that are much more informal were not available to us, but we're still learning. And when we're going into committee hearings, when we're going into meetings, we understand completely the seniority perspective and how, freshmen have, being a freshman is tough. Being a freshman in the minority is even tougher. But, working our way through that. But when we are in these sessions where the cameras are on, a lot of people are talking into the cameras. They're only there to talk to the cameras. Everything seems to be so overly formal that where you need to have conversations, we don't. Even in committees, there is very little conversation. There's no back and forth. You have this is a much different committee than most, but normally the chairman, you have 5 minutes, you ask questions of the witness, you don't talk to each other, and that's it. So a couple of things. One, freshman orientation. What things do you think we should really address in freshman orientation to get that kind of camaraderie from the get-go? And two, in committee hearings or committees in general, how do you set up an informal way where you don't lose it to the floor where you have people bantering back and forth, but you can at least have conversations where this compromise or discussions take place and not just speech giving?
I think it's a wonderful set of questions. I'd say a couple of things. One thing I would stress in terms of orienting new members is helping members understand the history of the institution, and especially helping members see that Congress hasn't always worked the same way. That at different times, if you encountered the House of Representatives, you would have found a very different kind of institution, very different kind of budget process, a very different kind of committee system, very different sorts of relationships across party lines. And I think the reason it's important to see that is that it's very easy to come into just an existing structure where things are going a certain way and think, well, I got to sort of find my place here and figure out, how do I find the CNN camera and stand there and complain about Congress? There really are other ways for this institution to work, and it's up to the members so that reform is possible. And if there's something in particular that stands in the way of enabling the kind of work you want to be doing, that something could change. And it's entirely possible that there are other members who agree that it should change. I think that's very important, and just helping members see that this is up to them and that it could be different. And to your second question, I would get back to the question of cameras everywhere. There should be cameras in some places in Congress. There needs to be transparency. The work can't be done in ways that don't allow members to be accountable to their voters. But there also needs to be room for members to talk to each other, to bargain, to negotiate, to raise ideas that don't end up going anywhere, to raise suggestions and someone says to you why that's not a good idea, and then you can actually say, yeah, okay, that's not a good idea. You can't do that in public. You just can't do it. And I think a lot of members now feel like in order to actually advance anything, they've got to be part of some group that meets outside the normal process. That should lead you to think about how to change the normal process so that it enables that kind of work to be done and be the appropriate and proper work of the Congress. So I love C-SPAN. I'm a C-SPAN junkie, but there are rooms in which there shouldn't be cameras. And I think that idea has to be kind of socialized in this institution.
And I would, on the topic of committees, I would encourage more committees to experiment the way that we are today as we speak with different formats. And particularly this sort of notion of drawing out one issue until members who have questions or who want to sort of speak on that issue have had a chance to do so. I think that certainly from the perspective of a witness, an hour or so into this hearing, I have found that effective. And so just in general, being willing to try more different ways and getting out of the 5 minutes for a member of the majority, 5 minutes for a member of the minority, in order of seniority, who's present in the room, out of that box is a place that I would encourage folks to think of. And one of the advantages of having subcommittees of full committees is that's another venue for experimentation. So, and particularly since they are usually much smaller than the full committee. So if a subcommittee is having a hearing, that would be a great place to start experimenting with some different formats.
Go ahead, Mr. Perlmutter, and then Mr. Timmons.
I'm just thinking about sort of the physical.
You have to put your mic
on. Just in this room. So, Democrats on one side, Republicans on the other side. We each have our own ante room. And, you know, there's no real, if we just had one ante room where we all got to come in and we're visiting and it's not in front of the camera, you might get a little more socialization. But I mean, the physical premises and the premises upon which the physical premises are designed is to separate us. So what do you think about that? I mean, I'd like, and there's nothing that stops us. And I often will go over to the Republican side if I want to get a deal done on something. But it really, the layout of the place is designed for separation.
I think that's a very important point. And I will just underline something you yourself just said. Nothing is stopping you. This is a point that Yuval has made several times, is that if there are changes that you want to see made, you are the people to make those changes. And maybe that starts with breaking down the norms of only gathering with other members of your party before a committee hearing. But you're absolutely right that the sort of evolution of the Congress and its physical space means that you are sort of physically separated in many situations. But I would just encourage you to be the change.
The primary difference in the ante rooms is which cable news channel the TV is turned to. And one has like Whole Foods sandwiches and the other Chick-fil-A. But other than that, it's Vice Chair Timmons.
Thank you. I want to talk about committee structure, and I'm going to clarify this. Remove partisanship from this, because I think if the tables were turned, it wouldn't be any different. I'm going to clarify that. So right now there's 25 Ds and 18 Rs on Ways and Means, 33 Ds, 26 Rs on approps. I can keep going down. HASC is actually the only one that is close. It's 3128. T&I is 3631. Financial services is 3024. So there was a huge kind of tussle over the number of members on each committee at the beginning of the year. And my understanding is that it's entirely at the Speaker's discretion, and there's historical precedent that's argued over, but it's kind of Wild West. You don't really know what's going to happen. Everybody's got ideas, but until the Speaker's office actually says this is how we're going to do it, well, and there was negotiation after that because they go back and forth. Is there any, one, given a slim majority, you would think that the committees would be more similar to that? And again, if Republicans were in the opposite situation, it would be the exact same. So is there any thought to maybe an algorithm that dictates it, as opposed to just kind of saying, we're going to figure this out and you're going to deal with it to the other side? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that in a sense, it's a matter of prioritizing that. I would probably urge you against replacing bargaining with an algorithm. I don't think that's the way to, and certainly to take on the culture of this institution. I would say that this kind of decision has to be made by what you describe as a tussle, by a bargaining process. I think it makes sense that if a majority is exceptionally large, that it has an exceptionally large majority in the key committees. A very tight majority should allow for closer votes in those committees, and so closer party alignment in those committees. But I think it makes sense for that to be worked out in a negotiating process at the beginning of each Congress. I mean, ultimately, this institution is an arena for bargaining. It's an arena for deal making, for accommodation, for dealing with each other. And I think it's very important over and over and at every layer of the institution to see it that way. Because Congress is the only place in our political system where people with differing views, representing different elements of our society, actually deal with each other, literally deal with each other. That's why legislation can allow for durable solutions to public problems, because people are heard, because views are moderated in order to get through the process. That kind of bargaining process is really what this institution is for. I think that's how legislation should move, and how internal decisions ought to be made too.
Conversely, again, I'm very clear to say that if the tables were reversed, it'd be the exact same. So next Congress, if the tables do turn and there's a very slim majority, I would say it would be inappropriate for there to be a 7-seat difference on Ways and Means if it was a 6-seat majority. So like
Yeah, and I think that
continue.
ought to be a fight between the two party leaderships and
But
between
the response is going to be, we're going to do what y'all did. And that's not good. So we got to break the cycle of that. And I don't know.
Yeah,
Okay.
I agree with that. But here's a member saying so, right? And that's the only way it can happen.
Sophomore.
Yeah, and I'll just say that that I agree with everything you've all said. And I would also point out that some of this is driven by the demands of who wants to be on the committees. So, you know, when among the sort of things that go into the tussle are what do you know, some committees are more attractive than others. And one of the things that has to be balanced is who wants to be on which committee. And it is, at the end of the day, it's a political question. I don't mean that in a pejorative way. I mean that in a everything you do is politics way. And so I agree with you all.
Go ahead, Mr. Joyce.
I was thinking about this a little more. The idea of obviously wanting sunshine laws to be adhered to and transparency. And I'm not sure if I can't recall it ever happening before. You might know. And when we go on a retreat and the Democrats go on a retreat, well, would it make more sense if like it had a bipartisan infrastructure committee retreat? Or because, you know, I know in appropriations, many other members on different committees don't really understand how we operate, but we understand how we operate and we can have the discussions on the things that are taking place. Has that existed before, or do you think it'd be worthwhile?
I don't know if it's existed before. Mr. Kilmer, you can correct me. I seem to remember this being an idea that you all ideas of this kind were ones that you discussed in the last Congress.
Yeah, that's all right. You know, in the last Congress, we both talked about having the institution have a bipartisan retreat, in part to acknowledging that there are going to be differences in goals, but that you know there may be relationship building and at least some alignment on some of these big ticket issues to at least say, hey, what do we want to try to get done? And then similarly within committees. I mean, part of the reason our committee did a bipartisan retreat is we recommended that other committees should do a bipartisan retreat. So, yeah, ours was by Zoom, unfortunately, this time around. I want to, so Dr. Reynolds, in your written testimony, and you spoke to this a bit, I'm trying to remember how you worded it. We're looking at legislative behavior and interpersonal behavior. Right, and actually next week's hearing, we're going to kind of dive into these issues around interpersonal behavior. But I feel like it is, to some degree, one of the big challenges. You know, the working part of this, right, is hamstrung sometimes by the inability to get past the interpersonal. Are there levers you would pull on that front? I mean, obviously, we're going to dive into that issue more next week. But if you have guidance for us, I think sometimes the work is stymied by, I mean, we have members who don't want to be in a room with each other, right? And I think sometimes we have this notion that trying to work together is somehow leaving your ideology at the door. I don't think that's what it means, right? Like people come here to represent their values, but sometimes we can't even move forward on things on which we agree. So thoughts on levers that this committee might look to recommend to get at some of these interpersonal issues, whether it be bipartisan retreats or other stuff we haven't thought of?
Well, I think that those kinds of ideas are one way to do that, which is they both allow members to get to know each other and allow them to talk substantively without being on display, which I think makes an important difference. I would say that some of this is also a function of allowing changes in the structure of the work to gradually change members' sense of what happens in this institution. A number of you, in talking about experiences in state legislatures, said, well, people didn't just abuse, they just didn't abuse the open rules. And I think part of the reason for that is a sense that after a while, the culture of the institution changes around the structure of the work. If you made some of the kinds of changes to structure that we're talking about, I think early on, the first result of that would look pretty ugly. It would be people using those new venues to grandstand. But over time, as it became apparent that there isn't any camera here, so why are you talking to me like I'm a cable news viewer? It would just become people would through experience come to approach each other a little bit differently. It's hard because, you know, it's not this isn't a kindergarten class, and you can't just tell people to behave, right? Everybody here is an adult who has achieved a lot in his or her life, and who's very ambitious, who worked hard to get here and deserves to be here. And so there's no one who can really tell anybody else to behave. And I think the only way to change behavior is to build a culture around around forms of work that encourage people to take themselves and others seriously. And, you know, that's not a simple thing.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would also just say that at the end of the day, it's important to ask yourselves as, you know, people who come to work in a workplace, how do you establish the norms for what is acceptable conduct, and who do you look to enforce those norms against one another? And, you know, Yuval and I can give you suggestions, but at the end of the day, this is the place where you do your work, which is fundamentally what people send you to Washington to do. And so it's about, some of it is just about, you know, what do you consider acceptable behavior, and how do you set that for yourselves in the same way that would happen if you were in the diversity of jobs and workplaces that you had before you came to Congress. One challenge that I think the reform community and folks who kind of think about the working of Congress face is drawing the lines between what makes Congress unique as an institution and as a workplace and what doesn't. And I think this is an area where there is a lot to be learned from sort of how do we build a good workplace. And I'm eager to watch the folks that you bring for the second hearing on this topic, because I think they will have some constructive thoughts on this as well. But I think, again, I would just remind you that at the end of the day, you're all coming to work in a place, and there are, and it is up to you to determine how to enforce good standards of behavior with your colleagues.
Yeah. I will say I have sitting on the desk in my office a framed version of the rotary four-way test. Is it the truth? Is it fair to all concerns? Will it build goodwill and better friendships, and will it be beneficial to all concerned? And I'm reminded on a daily basis how often we violate that in this place, right? And that it is a problem, right? It does not engender goodwill or the ability to be productive. I want to make sure if other members have threads they want to pull before I know votes will be called soon. Go ahead, Vice Chair Timmons.
We talked about budget reform earlier. We made a number of recommendations last Congress. I think there were 7 of them: annual fiscal state of the nation, biennial budget resolution, a number of other changes. And we used the Joint Select Committee that was ultimately unsuccessful, and we kind of built on what they started. Any additional recommendations that you think we could make that in that area that we have not?
Well, one idea I get at in my written testimony as illustrative of a kind of change that might affect culture, and I'm cognizant of saying this with an appropriator in front of me, is to think, is to think about the distinction Congress draws between authorization and appropriation as an open question. Because if what we're asking is how do we make the work of the committees matter more, then surely anybody who's had the experience of seeing an authorizing committee at work can recognize that much of what happens in their work doesn't seem like it's going to make a difference, while the appropriators are firing real bullets and spending money on programs. There are ways of thinking about combining authorization and appropriation, maybe just in some areas of Congress's work, and maybe in general, that I think could really change the way we think about what the budget process is for and what members do with their time. The distinction between authorization and appropriation is longstanding in Congress. It's been done since the 1830s. And it was done actually with this notion of parallel processing in mind. It became difficult for Congress to spend necessary funds because there were debates about broader kinds of legislative questions. And so the House and then the Senate decided to just put spending on its own path, on its own track, so that necessary things could be done while these other debates were happening. But I think we're at a point now where if the question is how do you get members to become interested in channeling their ambition through the work of the committees they're in, breaking that barrier between authorization and appropriation is a question to think about. It's not a new idea. There was a proposal like this in the 1980s that Senator Kassebaum and Senator Inouye proposed that got pretty far in the process. Obviously, appropriators tend not to like it, but I think that that would be a dramatic way to change the budget process. It would be a way to help the work of the committees matter.
We could get 10 votes. Might get 10 votes. We're not getting 12 though.
Before you get too excited, Mr. Perlmutter, my advice here would be to actually to go back to something Mr. Joyce said earlier about you sort of made a passing reference to the degree to which you as an appropriator, Mr. Kilmer as an appropriator, you actually are very well read into the details of what's in the bills that you've worked on. And I would encourage that as a sort of starting place for any reforms, that much of what, to the extent that appropriations process continues to work, it is because you and your colleagues do the hard work of digging into those details. And even if what we ultimately end up with is one big omnibus vote on the floor, having done the sort of deliberative work in the early stages is not to be lost. And in fact, that's sort of, I think, what we should protect. And so that's less of a specific recommendation, but more of a principle for thinking about additional budget and appropriations reforms.
Not paying the appropriators compliments ever. You want to make this place work.
Go ahead.
I do have something.
You have to turn on your mic.
A little bit. And it's sort of this chicken and egg. The structure of the place and the type of work we do can add to collaboration and working together. But Beth and I were just talking about the women's softball team. And William and I played golf against each other. And David and I play baseball against each other. And in a context that isn't legislative, but is like normal, not so much baseball or anything else, but sports or outside of this place, relationships can be developed, especially the women's team. It's bipartisan and bicameral. So it develops relationships not just here, but over across the way. And, you still have the whole electoral thing, Democrat or Republican, but in at least in that instance, relationships are developed that go beyond sort of, okay, what's in the budget today or, just pure work. And I think that makes a big difference. In the Codells and those kinds of things, all of a sudden you've got a relationship on a different level that allows you to have the conversation, even in a setting where you're divided like this room. What's your reaction to that?
So I think building relationships among members is important. It feels a little, I feel a little out of place saying this at what I believe is Seersucker Thursday in the Senate, which is one of that chamber's greatest examples of this. But I don't want to oversell the importance of those opportunities to build relationships. This gets back to something I said in both my written and oral testimony, which is that we have to ask ourselves kind of what are the interpersonal relationships in service of? And they can be helpful, but at the end of the day, what matters is the degree to which you can use them to do good legislative work, and making sure that we're not sort of romanticizing or being overly nostalgic about a world where members, because they lived here with their families, had dinner together. That is important, but it is. I don't want to oversell it as a solution to the challenges that you face.
I agree with that. But it is, I think, as you say, a chicken and egg issue. It does matter that members, when they're in a professional setting in a committee, know one another and can't just use another member as a prop, but have to think, well, that's somebody I'm going to see on Thursday at the baseball game, or that's somebody whose family I know. That obviously does make a difference. But I just think it's easy to overstate the degree to which change can work in that direction. I think that ultimately, if you really want to change the culture of the institution so that it can be a more effective legislature, the kinds of changes that involve actually structuring the work to enable cross-partisan bargaining and accommodation are going to matter more. Not to the exclusion of it just mattering that you see each other as human beings, but ultimately you have to work together as legislators.
Coming back to the chicken and the egg, say, William,
turn on your mic.
If I've got an idea that I need some help with, and I think that he might be interested in it, or at least I'm not afraid to approach him, or I know that I can approach him to help me shape this thing. So, I mean, our business is a people's business. It's a people business. It isn't just a legislative business. It's a people business. And these relationships are key. I agree with you guys, though. You've got to still feel like, even if you work together, can you get something done? Can you have a real product that benefits America in some fashion or another? So thank you for being here today.
Any other questions? I think that buzzer was the sound of votes being called. So I actually have one more quick one. Oh, well, maybe quick one. Both of you made references to state legislatures as models, right? The notion of having co-authors listed that might be cross-partisan. The notion of having a budget process that actually looks like what you're actually doing. The idea of providing floor control to the committees at times. You know, these were all recommendations you made to foster better culture and collaboration that we can learn from state legislatures. Any other lessons from state legislatures that we should be looking at, that we should be, you know?
I would just say, I think it makes sense for this committee to think in a formal way about learning from state legislatures, inviting members to offer ideas that come from their state, maybe from their own experience. For those who were state legislators, there are a lot of ways in which the state legislatures are built on the model of Congress, but there are also a lot of ways in which, because they've had to solve various problems along the way, they've innovated the legislative process in ways that Congress could learn from. And I think that's the case in many state legislatures. There's been a lot of innovation in state legislatures in this century, in the past 20 years. And, you know, they're living in the same culture that you are. They're living in the same political culture in the same country. And so surely there are a lot of ways to learn.
Terrific. Okay. I want to thank our witnesses for their testimony and for gamely participating in our first roundtable hearing. I'd also like to thank our committee members for their participation and willing to try something different. Without objection, I also want to thank the folks who are recording the proceedings and the folks from C-SPAN. Thank you for being here. I think we're on C-SPAN 8 today. Thank you, the Ocho. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit additional written questions for the witnesses to the chair, which will be forwarded to the witnesses for their response. I ask our witnesses to please respond as promptly as you are able. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days within which to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion in the record. I also want to thank our committee staff for putting together a great hearing with 2 terrific experts. Thank you very much. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks.